All right. Well, welcome everyone to our first meeting of the Design School Fund group. I did put, as I mentioned, I put the agenda in the chat. So we have quite a few things we have to get through today, and we're really looking forward to getting your feedback on some things that we've been working on. We're going to start out with some check-ins, and then we did want to give space for people to ask questions, to clarify anything that might still be, that people might still have uncertainty around with as far as the purpose of the Design School Fund and what our role will be as we're designing some of these structures. We're then going to take a little bit of time to do to review some possible proposals. So we already have projects that are seeking funding. Benji has one that he will be sharing, and not sure if anybody else on here. Claire, I'm not sure if you would like to mention anything that you've been thinking about requesting funding for, but if anybody else has thoughts on a project that they would like to request funds for, we can share just very briefly what that is with the group so that we have some sort of working knowledge of where the money is needed and can help set some of the context for us moving forward. We're then going to be sharing some of the ideas that the leadership has come up with. And Luke, if you don't mind, I'm just going to mute you real quick. Thank you. And then so we'll share some of the ideas that we've come up with so that we can get some feedback from everybody here. And then we're going to take some time to just have an open discussion and brainstorm. We'd love to hear some of your ideas once we have all of this context setting. Any ideas that other people might have for setting up some of this governance. And we'll also provide opportunities for anybody to share after this meeting, and for anybody who is not able to join, they can also provide that information. Oh yes, and Luke, Raya, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself too, just because this is a closed meeting, we just want to make sure that everybody here is part of the Design School Fund group.
Hey, hi, it's Simon. I have no idea why it's coming up as Luke Raya. It's an old name on an account. I don't know how to fix it, but here I am. Hi, everyone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in on my laptop so that I can turn my video on. So I'll see you guys in a minute.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no worries, Simon. That happens to me. Sometimes I'm Juliet. That's not somebody else's. Okay, so I would love to get started with some check-ins. Just kind of letting us know how you're showing up and how people are doing today. I hope everybody had a wonderful weekend. I had a really nice weekend. I had to do some traveling for work, but I extended it and went on some adventures around Connecticut and the Albany area in New York. So I was able to see the Hudson Valley region and go on some hikes and see some friends. So feeling relaxed and ready to go this week. I'll pass it, just for the sake of time, I'll pass it on to Roberta. Would you like to share with us how you're doing?
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Feeling just well held from the recent listening circle. I did take Susan's advice and go out and just spend some time among the trees and the woodland critters and just let that all sink in. It was beautiful. And yeah, I'm just up for learning more about this process. And I do have an idea for a possible project, but it's not to the point where I would actually ask for the funding yet. But if you want people to put that on the radar of this group, I'd be glad to do that. And I'm going to pass it on to Marta.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I don't know if this is atingente, no sé cómo se dice, if this is current to say that, but I was thinking about the process that you had in a personal level, the conflict that was before. I don't know if it's, I just wanted to say that I didn't know about anything of that. Even I was in the group, I didn't get it. But in a priori, I wanted to apologize in advance for whatever that I can say in the future that trigger you or harm you in any way. I think what we are doing is so complex that we need to keep our heart open and our channels open. Is so important because it's like the other side of the coin. Much quality in our relations, we generate more quality in what we do. So I just wanted to say that I appreciate everyone, but sometimes we have those days and we say things wrongly or whatever, and I just want to apologize in advance and just come to me and tell me. Okay. Brian.
Yes, hi. Been under the weather for the last week or so and just getting back into things up to about 80% and trying to deal with a big backlog of work. So I'll pass it over to Claire.
Thanks, Brian. I'm glad to see you here. Thank you. For those of you who've been following on some of the Telegram channels, you know that things are busy with Cascadia, and I'm feeling like there's a lot happening here. There's a lot happening on the ground in Victoria, and I'm glad to be here. I'm going to pass to Janet.
Thank you. Yes, hello everyone. I'm Janet Dill and I live in Vermont. And this is actually my first live event with Design School. So I'm kind of catching up from the initial set of lectures, and I'm just interested in the work and in supporting the work. And so kind of dipping my toe in here. Things are going well and just very busy. So but glad to be here, and I will pass it on to Jonathan.
Yes, likewise, things are actually very good here. Weather's beautiful, and we spent the weekend visiting 2 eco-villages and a key contact in Ithaca with regard to the Bioregional Learning Center. So that was our weekend. And I'll pass it on to Simon.
Hey everyone, it's been a little while since I've seen all your faces, so it's glad to be back. I have a lot of updates, but I'm going to try and keep it brief to 2. Number 1, I am right now in Bajidupar, and I've just come down the mountain from Nabusimuke, which is the indigenous capital for the Arhuaco people. And so I've got some very interesting connections there. I was there helping a friend of mine with a documentary. And so I was doing some translating for him. And they have access to a couple of 100,000 of hectares that they would like to work on regeneration projects in very important bioregions. So I'm hoping I can continue to develop this relationship. I also have a relationship with some of the Kogi leadership here, which is fantastic. And then the second thing is I'm on my way to Barichara. So I'm going to be on a bus tonight to Bucaramanga, and then hopefully tomorrow morning to Barichara. So I'll see some of your faces when I get there. And I will pass to, and I'm sorry if who hasn't spoken, who's next? Can I see a hand?
I think it's just PB and J that are left.
Yeah, PB and J.
Okay. Okay, let's go with Benji first.
I figured yellow shirt and a hat would pass the yellow shirt and a hat. I was just guessing. Got lucky. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Things are just rolling right along. There was an offer made on a property here in Paonia yesterday for a site for Bioregional Learning Center, and it wasn't accepted, but we're not losing faith, and I think more importantly, we're galvanizing around shared purpose here and getting really excited. So Yeah, just meeting with the core team this afternoon as well to do some visioning. Marta included. Can't wait to do that with you. And I'll leave it at that. Over to Peanut.
Hey, everybody. I am sort of in I would say a mixed state. I feel really wonderful from the listening circle we just had. And I thought that was just beautiful. And I'm also going through some emotional roller coaster things. And right now I'm in sort of a low phase and exhausted. But so it's sort of like this mix of beauty and just feeling kind of low at the same time. That's me. Joe.
I thought I would show you this really cool rock I found yesterday. Isn't that amazing? Talk about story of place, right? This rock is embedded in a layer of sediments. I found this on the walk to a very special piece of land in Barichara yesterday that I've been asked to play a guardianship role of. And I'm sitting in the sort of like the spiritual kick to the pants that happens when sacred places invite you to be their guardian. It's not exactly like you feel awesome when that happens. You feel like, oh crap, am I going to be responsible for something like this? It's actually a big deal. And so I'm feeling closer and closer to being like this rock in Barichara, which is cool. Feeling more and more like the landscape is just grabbing hold of me. And I'm really excited for today and so happy that Anna's facilitating for us because I think that what we're doing with this Design School Fund could become a real powerful way of cultivating the way that we build culture in the school and really practice participatory finance and participatory governance. And that's a big deal. So with that, dude, Simon, can't wait to hug you. And then back to Anna.
Very exciting that you'll have another visitor soon. Hopefully Simon will join your little square of future meetings, but you'll all be together. Yeah. So yes, we now we can start by opening up the space to anybody who has any questions still for where the Design School Fund, what the purpose of the group is, what it is we're going to be doing. I know that there were some questions raised in the Telegram group that we just wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to ask questions. And I'm also going to pass it over to Joe and Penny just to help clarify some things a little bit more. But does anybody have any questions that they would like to get started now that maybe was not addressed in any of the posts or in the Telegram group?
Just, I think it would be good to remember to close that question. So what are the function of what we are going to do? I think it's good to say something, Joe.
Yeah, and if it's okay, I'll speak to that. So one of the elements of governance that I've learned in practice is that it's good for leadership to build a leadership culture, and then for leadership to create contexts to practice governance, and then gradually make those contexts clearer by creating structures together, which means there's always a little bit of confusion in the beginning about who has power and who doesn't, and what is the purpose and what's not. And that's a healthy part of beginning to experience governance together. So with the Design School Fund, we have a process where back in March, Penny, Benji, and I created the Design School, and we made all the decisions about how money is spent and about pretty much everything. And we'd sometimes ask people for their opinions, but we made all the decisions. And we also made the decision from the very beginning that we were going to invite members of the school to help us govern the Design School Fund. And we communicated that. And so this is the beginning of that process of actually learning how to govern together around a specific focus. And the focus is starting small, so it's sort of like a sandbox. And that's just so that we can get really clear on how to do this. And so one of the points of confusion that came up in the Telegram group was whether we're dealing with the budget of the Design School as a whole, or just something that is allocated into the Design School Fund and then is managed by the group that manages the Design School Fund. And I would say at this point, there's really not much difference between those two, just a minor difference, which is we're receiving funding from Novo Foundation to pay for Penny and Benji and me. And that used to be covered by the Design School Fund, and now it isn't anymore because we'll be funded in a different way. But that the purpose of this group is to create really good clarity around what is the Design School Fund, how does the Design School Fund allocate funding? It's like, what are its criteria? What are its purposes? What's its general scope of focus? And I think we'll see really quickly that the main constraint for its scope of focus is the amount of money we have, which is that the Design School Fund currently has money from membership dues, as well as money that came in through the Scholarship Fund, which covered membership dues, and some general donations, but there haven't been very many of them. So basically, we have a fairly small amount of money, and we've already been subtracting out operating costs, paying for the Mighty Networks platform, for Zoom accounts, and we've been covering lower than subsistence level income to Penny, Benji, and myself until this month, paying ourselves $600 a month each for the last few months. And so, so right now, what the scope of this Design School Fund is to manage money that will go to projects within the design school. And one of the key differentiators for clarity is that design level members are allowed to participate in the Design School Fund, whereas community members are not. So community members are the ones who pay $5 a month or $50 a year, whereas those who pay $50 a month or $500 a year, just the design level members, can request funding from the Design School Fund and can request to participate in governance of the fund, which is why everyone who's on this committee is a design level member. And the one other step I'll just mention is that for us to begin having transparency of governance, we formed a Design School Leadership Council first. And then in the Leadership Council, we created this committee just so that we'd have a transparent way of doing it, which is that with the blessing of the Leadership Council, Anna said she would take the lead on facilitating this process. And that's really all that's happened. It's not that the Leadership Council has made any other decisions. It's just we agreed that someone in the Leadership Council would lead this process. Anna said she'd do it. We all said, thank you, Anna. And then here she is. So is that clear enough for now, or are there any other questions that brings up? Because I think when we get into the possible processes, proposing some ideas about how to structure and manage the fund, which Anna has been preparing, we'll start to see a little more clearly how we're starting to do this.
Hey,
Simon.
so I just have one clarifying question, and it's a little sensitive because I think it's the root of the confusion that was in the original conversation. And I guess, so the way I would perhaps phrase this question is, if new funding comes into the school from now, who decides and how do we decide how that funding is allocated, whether it comes to the DS fund or whether it's outside the scope of our council? Because right now it sounds like there's some more funding that's outside the scope of this council.
I could say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say the only place that other funding is going to go is to operating expenses. So we're just, before the money comes into this group to allocate out to projects, we'll pay for any operating expenses that come up. So for instance, there's the Zoom accounts are coming up soon, like September and December. The Mighty Network renews in January. There's like domain names that we bought recently, things like that. Just the operating expenses of the school itself will be taken out before we have money available for this group to allocate into projects. So
Yeah.
that's the only, and we're not gonna, the three of us were also being paid from there as an operating expense. And now we're gonna be funded starting in September from somewhere else. So the other possibility is that we might be bringing in somebody to help with some of the like community tending or admin or something like that at some point soon. So we're already starting to think about that, and that would be an operating expense as well.
Yeah, and I would add one other thing that is confusing now because it's early in the process. which is that we are working on creating collaborative funding ecosystems for the landscapes. So like bringing money to the Greater Takaranto bioregion or bringing money to the Colorado Basin, which would be beyond the scope of the Design School Fund and may not even enter the design school, depending on where it comes from. And preferably it goes directly to the local organizations and their landscapes. So I think there's some confusion at the moment about where would that belong as it relates to the design school, because it hasn't come up yet. And then the other piece that I think relates to what Penny said about increasing operating costs, which is that we do plan to give fully transparent accounting of the school, which Penny has done on a monthly basis so far. So we'll keep all of the financial information of the school will be transparently available. And I think the place where we make decisions about expanding the school scope and its operating costs initially will be handled in the Leadership Council until we build more clarity of governance around it. So then we'd know who does the reporting and how the reporting is done and so on. Right now, while we're relatively small, that's not an issue. But if it gets more complicated and bigger, then it'll need to. And the reason I bring that up is we might do things like we're currently talking about running edge prizes, where we might raise $150,000 for the Cascadia bioregion. And that would be funding for projects within that bioregion. It wouldn't even come into the design school. It wouldn't be an operating budget, and it wouldn't be part of the design school fund, because it would be a direct linkage to the landscape. So in that sense, it wouldn't be in the purview of what we're talking about here. But you can see how this is really confusing because we don't have good clarity of structure for those differences. So I think we're going to be making it up as we go along for that part, if that makes sense. Is that clear enough for now, Simon?
It is. I'd like to make a suggestion just in terms of conceptually how we might explain it. So right now we've sort of stratified it negatively. It's like, well, it's not this money, it's not these costs. So perhaps we could say very clearly what it is, very positively. It's like, well, it's the money that's coming in from the dues, from the memberships. That's the revenue that's going to be the purview of this group. That's very clear. And then in accounting, there's a matching principle that we say, well, let's allocate the costs that are relevant to that revenue. And so to me, it's very clear that the costs so far is the costs of, the Mighty Networks payments and those operating costs. And it did make sense that your costs were in there for now, insofar as they're related to the running of this school. So I think there was very, very insensitive discussion around this, but I could sort of read between the lines and see where the confusion was from an accounting perspective. So just tell me whether I've got this right. If we say from a positive perspective, we're saying that all of the funds that come into the school from dues, from membership dues, that's the purview of this group here. And we're deciding how we can allocate what's left over from that once we've paid for any relevant design school fees. And that's the bit that we're getting involved in. And it's perfectly okay. And I think very reasonable to say that might evolve over time.
Yeah, and we'll see that there's going to be a proposal later for a discretionary fund, which may or may not come into being, which would be possibly siphoning some of that money into a parallel fund, but that would be a decision of this group. So as of now, what you're saying, I think is absolutely correct. And then as we make decisions, we may evolve it. Roberta, did we address your question, or did you have something else?
Not quite. This is kind of a clarifying example of just to help it gel in my mind. And so I love the idea of the design school fund. I understand its purview and how where the money's coming from. But as you said, we don't have much money in the fund right now. And as this work continues, I can see the value of these small, they're not really grants, but these small chunks of money to allow things to happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. So I do think that limiting the input to just the membership might be limiting on what we're able to share across the bioregions. And I do understand that each bioregion will be trying to, bring in the funding needed to do work in that bioregion. That's a separate thing, but I love the idea of this kind of startup money that we can help disseminate to projects. So as a member of this group, I'd like to just keep it, is it possible that we can actually fundraise or whatever you want to call it around beefing up this this fund so that we could have more than, you know, the small amount that you've just said that we have now to work with over time, not immediately. I know we
I
got a
would
lot of
say-
work cut out for
I would
us,
say
but
yes.
I'd love to see it grow.
Yeah, I would say yes, and that's what's interesting about sharing the ownership as we govern the school together is we gradually have more and more of a sense you're not just a member of the school, but you're a member of a community in the way that you would have some kinship and ownership within the community. So you can go out and build the community's strengths and capacities and mobilize resources and support to it because you're an owner of it in the positive sense, if you know what I mean. Like you care for it and you're supporting it and nurturing it. And so I think that's very much in the spirit of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and we already have a link for like general donations if that people could donate into the fund itself outside of being a member. So we have one donation in there so far, but we do have it. So as a way.
Where is it, Penny, if you don't mind me asking, if that's not too off track? Because I think I heard about it, but I've like, maybe that's something we could do at Christmas time. We don't want any presents, but this is some work we really believe in. And so if you'd like to donate, please do.
I'll post it later, maybe in the
Cool.
meeting notes or something. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Simon.
Something Roberta said just made me think of this, but I think just 2 points. Number one, the best way we can raise money, raise what's in the school fund is to get more members. And so the more members that are in the design school, the more funding the fund gets. And then number two is, I'm seeing this as perhaps to begin with, at least it's an experiment in how we organize ourselves, how we govern ourselves. So it makes perfect sense to me that we start off with governance over quite a small amount of funds. And I suppose that there's a possibility in the future that if we all work incredibly well together, you know, there's opportunities. Well, hopefully there'll be more money to manage, and you know, we'll see what happens in the future. But it makes perfect sense to me that whilst we're starting, we're in this sandbox phase, that we get the protocols lined up first and work out how we're going to work together, and then we see how we go from there.
Back to you, Anna. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Those are great clarifying questions.
Yeah, thank you. And so the next part of the meeting, we wanted to start putting some of the decisions that we are going to be making into practice and making them more tangible and real. So we did want to invite people just to give a brief summary of some of the proposals that might be coming up. Benji already has a project that he would like to propose for some of the Design School Fund. And thinking about this, there also are others. For those of you who have been following the Mighty Networks chat, Chris Casillas has also mentioned that he has some projects that he is interested in getting funded as well. So as we are, this is going to be great practice, as Benji said. It's going to be great practice for us to really be thinking of this as a concrete experiment that we're going to be running. So the other thing to think of is that we want to be moving money quickly. We want to be able to allocate without too much, without too many processes slowing it down. And we also want to treat it as an experiment. So we might try it out different ways each time we allocate funding. That's one of the reasons why the leadership team is releasing $5,000 this time around so that we can practice allocating funds in the future. So yeah, if anybody, Marta, would you like to say something?
I have a question. How much funds we are talking about?
So
5,000 for this,
Okay.
this.
Yes, but that's not the entire fund that is available. We just want to be releasing funds at a certain rate so that we can practice, make sure that everybody is feeling that it is a collaborative process as we start to refine some of the things that we are doing. So I would love to pass it over to Benji and anybody else too who would like to share any ideas that they have for potential funds. You can also raise your hand and get in line.
I could just add a quick comment before we start here. As we're listening to these ideas, let's imagine that we had criteria or priorities for the fund, which is to say, well, okay, Benji's talking about something. Does that feel right for the fund or not? And what would it mean if we had criteria for that? Because what I found in practice is that it's really good to reveal our interests and agendas. Like Benji has an agenda, it's in service to members of the school, but it's an agenda. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually have a lot of problems with the idea of conflict of interest. I think it's a very unfortunate framing. It's better to say, is the interest that's being presented aligned with the collective purpose? And you'll see that Benji has an interest, but it's connected to a collective purpose. And there'd be some way of saying what the criteria or priorities are. For example, it's supporting landscape leaders. It's helping work in the community. It's doing regenerative work defined in such and such a way. You know, we want to be feeling into criteria as we hear these ideas, because these ideas are going to be the kinds of things we'd probably want to fund. So that's why we're already practicing the criteria without having them. So if that makes enough sense, I'll pass it over to Benji.
That makes sense to me. It feels good. I'm about to get my agenda off my chest. And just to start things off, I will say that the amount of money that we're needing to fundraise is actually the entirety of what's been allocated to the Design School Fund. We need $5,000 just to start things off. So how that informs our decision-making criteria, our process. And I think that, yeah, partial funding will obviously come into this conversation early on, but yeah, let me just set some context real quick for what it is that we're wanting to do. In the Colorado River Basin, you know, we're focusing at this subcontinental scale. I'll start with the big picture for just a moment. We are really coming together with a lot of clarity around the value of focusing at these subcontinental scales, these entire continental scale river basins, as a way of understanding bioregional learning as a nested process. We have 3 different communities within the Colorado River Basin who each have a very high capacity for carrying bioregional learning processes moving forward. That's Mexicali, Superior, and the headwaters of the Colorado River Basin. And there's a really compelling narrative within all of this that we're really leaning on. And that is the idea of the delta of the Colorado River coming into partnership with the headwaters, the mountains, the origin of water, to hold the geography of the whole basin as we all learn what it means to take care of place, take care of the whole basin, be people of place, learn at these scales, understand the nested dynamics and the tensions there. This almost wanted to happen on its own. I mean, this is almost like the geography of the basin wanted this to happen on its own. Eduardo reached out to me with this dream like 6 months ago, and here we are working to bring it into fruition. And another thing to support that story is that regeneration often works best when it starts high in the landscape and then works down. And so we want to lead into this story, and we have Regenesis now that is coming on board. We have some really interesting opportunities to work with them, to collaborate with them in Paonia. They've already been to Superior, Arizona, and there are clear opportunities for that partnership to be extended now. And Superior is really spearheading this effort to understand collaborative funding models. They're place-based, very relevant to this conversation we're having here today. And then in Mexicali, Mexico, there's an interesting opportunity to organize around a really big scale bioregional learning project that will create a lot of value and I think drive a lot of this. So all that to say, the story is really, I think, clarifying, it's compelling. And we want to host now a landscape leader retreat to bring together people from Mexicali, several people from Mexicali, one person representing Superior, Arizona, and several people representing Headwater communities, mostly in Paonia, and bring them to a beautiful location in the Rocky Mountains to really establish, to deepen a land connection with the top of the basin, to feel the whole, and for that to sort of be an anchor of connection for all of us. And we think that visioning processes from that particular context, from this process of forming deep land connection, will be really beautifully informed and inspired. And it seems like we're at the point in time now where by bringing us all together, we will get to the next level of collaborative capacity. And so we have 8 people who are signed up, who we've invited, who have accepted to come from the 15th to the 18th of September to Carbondale, Colorado, and we'll head up into the Frying Pan River Valley or Canyon. Beautiful area. I don't really remember exactly what it's called, but it's beautiful up there. It's stunning. It's high Rockies, and it's such a good time of year too. The aspen leaves will be changing color. It's just going to be psychedelic up there. And it's $800 per person. So it's $6,400, and then we will also need to cover airfare for Anna, who will be joining us from the Great Lakes, actually, as a facilitator and a connection to the Great Lakes, but also for Miracle, who's coming from Superior, and Eduardo is able to cover the airfare and the cost of the retreat for the people coming from Mexicali. So, and I'm getting a signal that I have an unstable connection. Hopefully you all can hear me. I can wrap this up pretty quick. And so the total cost is around $8,000. I'm guessing around $3,000 will be covered by Eduardo. That leaves $5,000. It'd be great to be able to get something from the Design School Fund, but like I said, we're going to need to fundraise in addition to that, no matter what. Maybe there's an opportunity there for us to exercise some other design lab in the design school to help us with that endeavor. But it seems right to start here and see what we all have to say about this. So I guess I'll leave it there. I don't know, Anna, if you want me to open up to questions or comments, or if we feel like moving forward.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions or comments for Benji? Claire?
Claire?
I just know from having done any kind of weaving work that often it's easier to get funding if you're looking for a project. This is from traditional funding sources of any kind. It's easier to get funding for a project, or it's easier to get funding for if you're part of an organization, and that the hardest thing is the people who are doing the weaving. And so it feels to me that that to catalyze the work, putting the work into putting the funds, sort of prioritizing them into the weaving work is a really, I just want to support that, just to say, yeah. And the other thing is that I've sort of, there's a little bit of me that is a little bit, sometimes looking for funding is actually an opportunity to connect with the community. I just think it is way harder for the weaving, like getting the funding for the weaving work. And so if the design school can be really catalyzing something, it would be to support the weaving stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think that's a good category to bring up, or a priority. I know that I jotted down a few things that I could see as being potential priorities. So Simon, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, and actually it's kind of related to what Claire said, and I'm perhaps going to phrase it in a different way. Coming from my callous capitalist background, what I'm kind of thinking here is we have a flywheel here, and what we want to do is we want to add more energy to the flywheel. And so I think that it's going to be incredibly useful if we allocate some of the funds for finding more funding. And I think that goes not just for the design school itself, i.e., let's maybe allocate some funding towards promoting the work that we're doing, getting more people involved, bringing more people into the school. But also for Benji's project, maybe at least the first part of the funding, whatever we agree to, can be to support Benji in reaching out to the communities involved and getting more support and getting more backing and bringing in more funding for that project. So yeah, I like the idea of having some funding that's allocated to the weaving, as Claire said, to be able to grow the fund and grow the audience and grow the people that we can reach and the people that can get involved and the people that can support us.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's a great point. Roberta?
Just before I speak, I just want to understand, are we still just responding to Benji's proposal? Because you said to raise your hand if you had something else, so I can hold off on this something else. I guess the only comment that I would have about Benji's is that I love the idea that we have $5,000 to distribute, but if we distribute it to one region, then even though it's like, who doesn't want to support that entirely? If I feel conflicted about that, because I do think it would be nice, especially in this first round, to just distribute the money and see, just from an experimental point of view, see what grows and thrives, and how it went, and any feedback we could have. So that does kind of fit into what Simon was saying about, yeah, if some of that money could be useful in bringing more money for that project, leaving some left over from this small amount, this $5,000, to sprinkle elsewhere, that would be ideal. And then I did have just a comment about a potential project that I'd like to just put on your radar, and a couple other thoughts. So, but I'll wait until we get there.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments for Benji before we move on?
I just wanted to add a little comment that we're starting to see a prototyping of criteria. So we're seeing that some of the criteria could be, how does this support building the capacities of the school? Another could be, how does it support the on-the-ground weaving process? Another is, how can it support a diversity of landscapes? And see, we're already starting to create some really nice candidates for criteria. And so, so I just want to name those to show how this trying on the idea rather than writing the list of abstract criteria is a really powerful way of doing this. And so I would personally love to hear from Roberta to continue that process.
Well, that's great. I actually have a little list of potential criteria that I'll put into the chat after. And I drew from your statement in your Medium channel, Joe, about like, this is basically what we're trying to do. And if you could just, it's very, very concise statement of what we're trying to do. And I think those things should be part of the criteria as well. Does it do this? Does it, so I think those things should be at least considered for criteria as well. But my project that I would just like to put on the radar, and I think maybe some of you have heard of this already, especially Benji, I know that you know, but I have this deep desire, or maybe a fantasy, maybe both, to do a podcast. It's something that would be a way to start showcasing regenerative work across our bioregion, building that sense of belonging through story of place, as Benji so, just beautifully puts it. And I did, I've gone far enough to look into what it would take to set myself up with the software and the equipment to do a fairly decent job at that work. And my thought was, if I could bring in half of that funding, which would be about $500 through the design school fund, I would work to match that from CB's sources. They've started also fundraising around this bioregional work. And if they can supply more, that would be great. So I'm not really ready to propose it as a concrete project yet because I need to have a better sense of how much buy-in I could get from, basically funding I could get through CB. So I wouldn't ask for any more than was needed to kind of bring us up to that, the level that's needed to move forward on that. But that would be huge because I just don't have the personal resources to invest in that, even though I would if I had them. So that I just wanted to throw that little idea out there. And yeah, I will share some of the criteria. Maybe we can just keep adding to this potential list as a way to start moving forward as we go to kind of capture some of these thoughts we're having about, yeah, that would be a good criteria. And I'll throw that into the chat. So thanks. Oh, and Simon, just to answer your question before moving on, my idea is that there would be some episodes, especially as we move forward, to capture that global scope, because I think that's a tremendously important part of the story, is that we understand the need for scale, and that what are we really trying to do is to regenerate the entire Earth. So stories from, yes, across the Earth, I thought Joe should certainly be one of the interviewed candidates because he could provide that global perspective. But primarily, especially initially, I'd like it to be a vehicle for us to share these stories about our bioregion. I don't know what's going on in Vermont, Janet. I can't wait to find out. And I'm so glad to actually put a face with your name, because we are bioregional sisters. And yeah, I'd love to learn more about what's going on in Vermont and be able to showcase. And I'd like it not only to be interview style, but I'd like to be on the ground and have some field interviews. Like, here we are doing this, and this is cool. And hell, I could even have a video component to it too. So yeah, my dream and my fantasy is pretty big, but we'll see where it goes, one step at a time. That's my challenge, is not getting ahead of myself. Anyway, yeah, cool.
Hi, everybody. I've been actually listening and moving around. I can't sit still, so I'm doing things in the next room, but I'm listening to everything. And first of all, I love what you've been saying, Roberta. And as people who are going to have lots of projects, and we have one already, we need to write it up because it's an amazing opportunity. But what it also, going back to your first idea about spreading it out, the benefit of that, even if we got a small grant to this project with 75 acres, and we have the freedom to regenerate the whole thing, bring in volunteers, raise money, have demonstration projects all over the property because they have all different settings. It's just an obvious for our kind of project. Just think, if we got a donation from, or if this organization, the design school is the premier funder, everyone will know about it. And if everyone gets enough of the money to be a supporter of some kind, inside their institutional framework, they will begin to be recognized all over the world for contributing to those projects. They don't have to do all the money for it, but they're contributing to that project, gives us visibility in places we won't get around to funding for a while. Oh, and there was one other thing that we were, but no, I can't remember.
Marta, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so question that raised to me is if whatever we use these funds, if it's splitted in different projects, when we would have more funds, or what is the timing to use another funds? That is one question. The second is, I would like to know more in detail about what are the different level of needs into the project of the Colorado River Basin, to know if some things are very important, how much we found on that, and also about the timing of the podcast, if you are ready to go, Roberta, or it is going to take 1 month or 2 months. That is the reason that I'm asking for when funds are coming. I'm personally very interested on the Colorado River Basin, because this connection in between these three parts, the three areas, are like is the catalyst for to be more organized and to come up with a story that really we can spread everywhere to organize better this Colorado River Basin. So I see these criteria again about timeline, and what will put more, if we select one project or the other or both, but what we need right now to advance, what will be more effective in the whole view, right? But supporting some projects first and then the other. Just, I don't know if you can get what I say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering if before we move on, would Joe or Penny want to speak to the timeline?
Yeah, I did want to speak to that, because this is the place where there's a big pile of question marks, which is, we don't know how much money is going to come in. We don't know how many people will become community members. At the same time, there's some really good questions coming up about Cascadia, because Brandon is really looking at learning from the design school for what they're doing with Regenerate Cascadia. Claire is very much a part of that conversation, but it's Brandon who's looking at his own organization, Cascadia Department of Bioregion, and asking which infrastructure should they share with the design school instead of rebuilding it. So it's in that very concrete place that Brandon is exploring, asking people to become members of the design school to participate in Regenerate Cascadia as it's expressed as a program within the organization. And so which opens up a really interesting question of how much could the Cascadia Activation Tour bring in new members, which is a good question. So I think we have some interesting questions like this, but we don't have good answers. And so part of sharing the governance around the Design School Fund is it invites all of us to dream together, because now all of us can ask, well, if Roberta has a podcast, how does that help not just the design school, but how does that help the Colorado project? How does it help the Cascadia project? We start to think in this way across our stories. And so I just wanted to name that piece, that we can practice collaborating together across regions because of the unique way we're organizing around sharing our learning between landscapes, since that's a big focus of the design school. But you say, well, what's happening in the Colorado Basin could really help Regenerate Cascadia. What's happening in Regenerate Cascadia could really help the Great Lakes, and so forth, because of the ways that we're collaborating. So I just want to name that into the mix. It doesn't answer any of those questions about timing, but it does reveal that there's a strategy landscape we can play on that landscape together. And Penny.
I'll just add that one of the ideas that Anna and I were throwing around, and it's based on something that happened here in Barichara, is what we're doing now, basically, but in a more like formalized format, where the people who have projects that they would love funded all come together into a process and share about their projects with each other and look at the whole system, look at the system as a whole across. So you're sharing about your individual project, but you're seeing the other projects across the system. And then that group could possibly actually decide how to allocate the funds to itself, to each other. as a way to build the trust and to build the systemic view and to be actually collaborating across the landscapes.
Yeah, that was one of the ideas that we were going to be bringing up in a later in the agenda, but I think that this is a really good time to bring that up. And instead of thinking of some of the criteria that we're coming up with as hard and fast rules, just thinking of them as guidelines that can help the people who are coming together to discuss their projects make some decisions all together, and ultimately they would be the ones that would divvy up the money that is available between themselves. That seems like a very collaborative process. Simon, would you like to share?
Yeah, hi. I'll try and be very brief because I've already taken a lot of space. Something you were saying there, Penny, reminded me of some of the training I've been doing on liberating structures. So I'd love if we had the opportunity at some point, maybe another breakout to discuss how those could be really useful in basically ensuring that everybody we do very well at this, but ensuring everybody has a voice and that all of those opinions are sort of synthesized up to the top. So that's just an idea that maybe I could present separately to everyone. What I'm noticing here is there's a theme developing around storytelling. I think Roberta's idea of a podcast is fantastic. I'd be very supportive of it. But when I'm talking about this flywheel, the more we can broadcast what it is that we're doing, the more we can publicize that effort and bring more people into the fold. So I think it's a fantastic idea, and I think that it would be a great idea to ensure that at least a part of the budget is allocated to storytelling, so that we can broadcast the wins that we're having and the successes, and also bring other people into the fold. And then very finally, just very quickly, well, actually, no, I'm going to skip that one and move on and let Jonathan have some time to speak.
Well, I just wanted to clarify something I had meant earlier about matching funds I know it's a very institutionalized way of doing it, but I am always more willing to give when there's a matching fund. And it could be the matching fund is the kickoff of the project, but it's not going to be there forever. So, they've got a max, that they're willing to do if they had to. And this is what the target of the design school is that the community would raise the rest. And of course, we're doing this project no matter what. So that's the whole, and that everybody, I know I love sales, but I hate fundraising. Now, there's no reason that I should hate fundraising. And there's no reason I shouldn't put my skills into fundraising, but it is an ick for me and a lot of people. So I think part of our work is to, and I go back to, who's the author of The Soul of Money? Lynn Twist. And if there are people who are kind of inside of that, it's a long time since I've done that. And maybe there's somebody who's raises money now and uses that kind of approach that could train the others in how asking for money is a wonderful contribution to someone. And Jonathan and I have the best story for why that's true. So matching funds, I think we might want to start everyone off with the expectation that let's do a matching fund and see how we can coach you into raising the money, because you're going to find all kinds of resources. When you ask for money, you may get all kinds of other things, and be open to that. It's a great way to tell the story over and over and over again, regardless of whether someone contributes. So I'd be happy to work on that if anybody, but I don't want to drive it, that's all.
Claire, would you like to go next?
Sure. I sort of wanted to pick up on something that Simon raised, but sort of was coming up for me as I guess wanting to make it about collaboration, wanting to make sure that there was the storytelling of the projects, I think is really such an important part of just what we're doing. And just sort of realizing that, you know, if there is the container of like the Edge Prize, which is about helping people to tell their stories, so that there is a sense of looking at what there is. So I don't know if people know this, but the Edge Prize people produce like a 5-minute video that tells their story as effectively as possible, as like in whatever they're doing. And that then makes them eligible for funding at different levels. Like there's the community can vote for them, as well as some of them are selected on other criteria. But I guess just the opportunity for people to tell their stories, so that there is the sort of diversity able to kind of go out into the field, so that a landscape is supported with that, like that opportunity, rather than the people. I guess what I'm worried about is the people who are in the know about the funds, that they are the ones that apply, and yet the people that are the weavers also know what the projects are that are requiring funding in order to be able to catalyze the work. So I don't know, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, and just wanting to make sure that each one of them is considered as important. And yeah, I think I've got a few things I wanted to say, but I think I'm going to stop there.
Guys, just very quickly, I need to dip out. So it was great seeing you all, and I'll catch up. I have my autopilot on the call, and I'm happy to share that with anyone. I think there's going to be some useful analysis of this conversation, so I'll share it with the group. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Simon. Let us know when you land in Barichara.
Bye, Simon.
Yes, I should be there tomorrow. Tomorrow afternoon, I would think. Okay.
Safe travels.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Simon. I think that you make a really good point, Claire, is because that is one of the topics that we want to make sure that we're discussing is how do people apply for these funds, making sure that it isn't just the people who are in the know who are able to request funding. Do we have any more questions or comments on some of the proposals that have been made so far? Because I think that this has been a really great brainstorming session. We've been getting a lot of starts to the priorities, I think, that are that we can set up around this fund. Brandon, yeah, so we did have Benji and Roberta, who brought up some of the ideas for potential funds being allocated. So Benji, primarily it was around the landscape leader retreat that is happening in the Colorado River Basin in September. And then Roberta brought up how she is designing a podcast that she's hoping to help tell the story of her bioregion, but it's also supporting the rest of the school. So we've been having a pretty in-depth conversation about how each of these projects, what are their strengths, what certain characteristics could we be considering as priorities for some of our allocation of funds. One of the things that we did want to share was some of the ideas that Penny and I had come up with, along with Joe and Benji's help for some of the governance structures. So does anybody have any other comments or questions before we move on to that? No, okay. So one of the things that I just see your head shaking, so we'll move on. So one of the things that we did bring up was the possibility of having a discretionary fund that either the leadership team or another small group of people who would be chosen, who are trustworthy, to be able to allocate funds quickly without any other proposal process or decision-making process that might slow things down. So we're interested in getting everybody's feedback on that. It would be probably smaller than what the allocated funds are right now. And it would simply be that if somebody were to come to either the leadership team or somebody within the DS fund group who was asking for funds rapidly, this team would be able to just make the decision, hey, yes, I can allocate $1,000 for this because it is in line with the vision and mission of the design school. So we're interested in hearing your feedback on that.
Yeah, and I'd like to just speak quickly about this. What we're talking about is, like, if we imagine that we have $10,000 in the current pool of money for the design school fund, but there's $1,500 that's just set aside as discretionary funds. So I just want to give like an example. If it was something like that, where there's a space that there's just some money that could move quickly up to some predetermined amount, like, oh, as long as the amount is less than $1,000 and this is the total we have in the pool, that there's a trusted person or a couple of people that could just allocate it. And then they would transparently report it. The reason for this is that sometimes there are things that are just in the flow of emergence, and a little fluidity would help them to move. Whereas there are other times, like what we just did with a couple of proposals coming in and saying, well, in the next month, we want to fund these 5 projects because these 5 people have come forth with their projects. And they would be different processes. So it's just an idea that we don't really have capacity for now because there's not much money in the fund. So we wouldn't create the discretionary pool now. But it's something to be thinking about as we feel into how could the design school fund become a really agile place of creating circulation and dynamism within the school. So it's more in that sense than to say we're creating it now. So I wanted to make that clarity. It's for us to be thinking in creative ways about how the design school fund could work, even if we're more limited in what we can do at the moment. So that was more of the way of thinking about this discretionary pool of funding. And just another bit of concreteness, for me and Bari Chara over the last 3 years, there's been pools of money that I've brought in that I brought to a council to make decisions with. But then I could just be out there in the field with my own pool of money doing things that were absolutely transformative because it was my creative inspiration in the moment. And so, so having the ability for the design school fund to work in a similar way is sort of the inspiration for this. So it's not that I need to be the one that's allocating that funding, but that there is discretionary fund that can work in that way. So we just want to invite it in as, it's almost like as part of the philosophy of the fund, rather than what we're doing at the moment, because the amount of money we have is too small. But in the future, as the fund grows, we wanted to plant the seed for this way of thinking to just explore it a little bit. So that was the idea here. So I hope that adds some clarity.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Brandon.
Yeah, I was just curious. So is the purpose of this meeting, I guess, to start to talk about some of these best practices and setting up a discretionary fund, or what is it to actually like decide and start allocating money?
The purpose is more of a brainstorming session where we're coming up with ideas to create the governance and the structures, not to make decisions on allocation at this time.
And has the broader discussion of creating a budget for the design school fund, has that already happened or been brought up at all? Like beyond not a discretionary fund, but like actually looking at a budget of how much is coming in and going out, and then creating like a yearly estimated budget that we can actually work with to know like how much should we allocate a month or.
Yeah, I can speak to that and say Simon asked that question directly at the beginning, and I think we created good clarity for it within the meeting. But we can talk about it afterwards, or you could talk with, or it'll be part of the way that we write it up. But we didn't talk about it as terms of an annual budget, mainly because we're in such a creative phase of not knowing what the allocations will be for the next few months, or like we don't know how many community members will come in.
But that's the point of this governance meeting, right? It's like we're talking about creating the processes. They don't exist yet, but creating the processes of how we allocate the funding is what we're talking about. It seems to me like, just for myself, like I don't feel like we're able to start throwing out money different places because we don't have a budget. We don't have this bigger picture. it just seems like, and I'm not like saying to not do anything, but it does seem like that the creating a budget that we can work with as the design school fund is a key part of the governance of any governance structure that we build. But that's just my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, did you want to say something? Or no?
Well, it kind of depends on how you're defining budget, but we have defined the $5,000 as the first amount that this group will be.
So who defined 5,000? You guys did, right? Like, or
Yeah.
did we do that?
No, we did. The
Okay.
leadership. did that, and then.
The leadership team? I didn't
Yeah.
see it in the governance, in the other group.
No, we were
No, no.
talking about Penny, Benji, and me who have managed the budgets thus far.
Okay, so that's
We're
like the
creating-
governance though, that's kind of like the decision making and governance that I'd like to say. It's like, why did we allocate $5,000? What impact does that have? Like, how much is left after that is, and that kind of thing is exactly why we should be having like the budget needs, and governance should be a discussion before we start just allocating funds. It seems like to me, but I'm just, one person and that's just opinion, but
Yeah, Brian, did you want to share something here? Is this related to what's happening now?
Yeah, just at the beginning of the meeting, we talked about the $5,000 and there was reference to the fact, I think in the Telegram group, that there's a total of, is it 12,000 that was in the design school fund? So having 5,000 as a starting point to get practice with how governance should evolve. We talked at the beginning of the meeting how all of this is emergent, and the best way to design governance is to have a starting point with a small amount of money that you get some project proposals, and then you criteria start to come to mind as you listen to the proposals. And that's what sort of happened in the meeting as Benji presented his proposal for Colorado, and people were raising different things that could become criteria for governance. I personally think the 5,000 is a good starting point, given that there's 10 to 12 in the design school fund. It's hard to think about a yearly budget at this point because it's so very, very early in the design school. We don't know how many members are going to materialize through the activation in Cascadia or elsewhere. More community members are signing up from the greater Tkaronto bioregion right now. So it's all going to evolve over time. That's the perspective I'm taking to it. And that's what I like the way that things are emerging right now with this meeting. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we do still have monthly income coming in from membership dues. We just don't have a good way of forecasting how many members are going to join or how many members are going to leave. So at present, it's what, about $1,500 a month that's coming in? Something like that? Total?
Well,
Was-
total 2,000 for the last month, but the month before it was a lot different. So and that's the total, including annual memberships that came in. So, one thing, Brandon, I did update that sheet a little bit with a little bit of a forecast so you could see the expenses going forward. And like the income, since I can't really predict that, I just made it steady as like a forecast.
Persistence forecasting.
So you can
Yeah.
kind of see if you look at that link, or I can give you that link again, you could see that forecasting out till February of next year, because that's when most of the annual members renew. So you can get a sense for that.
Yeah, that's great. And I do think that you can, like, doing a forecast budget is a pretty normal thing. I mean, there are a lot of membership organizations, and actually membership organizations tend to be one of the more study types of budget, because exactly, roughly how many members there are. It's not, and even if 15% leave every month, hopefully 15% join. So, but yeah, I think I'm also just kind of I'm curious, because last week, to my knowledge, right, like there was no $5,000 discretionary fund. So I think with me, I'm just kind of curious of what process can we build in as the design fund to create those funds or allocate funding, I think, as needs arise. And I'm a little bit more interested in the governance structure And I think it's great that it can be emergent, but I'm just a little bit curious of like how decisions are being made right now. And why we, yeah, I don't know, but that's fine. It sounds like everybody else is in agreement. But like, for example, like, do we have like voting structures or approval structures? Because right now it doesn't feel like any of that's in place. It kind of just feels like decisions are being made ad hoc, and there's not a lot of, it feels a little arbitrary to me.
Yeah, that's because this is the first meeting. And we had a Telegram group last week before the first meeting. So we are starting to set this up. I think after today, there'll be some good clarity about the first set of criteria for how the funds are allocated. And then with that, we can consider the amount of money that's available and how we want to practice using it. And that's where the decision-making, like the proposals for our decisions.
Okay. And so just to be clear, no money is being allocated today.
No.
People, okay, cool. So just ideas have been discussed and all the rest of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and partly this is where we want to be motivated toward action in the sense that as we're exploring the proposals and creating criteria, it moves us toward the ability to make decisions more quickly because there's a timeliness to the proposals that have come in. And so yeah, I think actually we're making really good progress on all of this. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that a lot of good ideas have been being brought up, and so I think that the only other thing that I did want to go back to was just seeing if anybody does have any direct feedback on the idea of what if we did have the people who are representatives of the projects once they're requested and once we agree that they meet certain criteria or meet certain priorities in order to potentially get funded, having those projects meet together and decide the dispersal between themselves instead of having outside members vote on allocation of funds. So this was the process that Penny had brought up earlier in the meeting that they had seen happen in Bari Chara. That worked very well, and really it does hone a very collaborative process and allows for the projects to see at more of a systems level of how do they impact each other. Benji?
Yeah, my question around this is maybe for Joe, and that is, what role did being in the same place, in the same landscape, within the same patterns of ecological connectivity, what role did that play in helping these projects to disperse funds amongst themselves? And is there an increased complexity, or is there some greater challenge from being abstracted into this space that would make that difficult, that you perceive?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think part of the answer is it's sort of like another question that needs to be answered, which is how much clarity is there about the strategic priorities of the moment? So like within the community of Bari Chara, everyone had a pretty good shared sense of that context. And here we're talking about it more at the level of the design school. So say, at the level of the design school, one thing we might say as a priority is getting more members, and therefore the storytelling, and therefore the community weaving. And so you can see some of these criteria that we named would fit into a shared understanding of the strategy or the strategic landscape. So I think that in that sense, and I made it more general on purpose to say that I think that kind of clarity can be offered even if it's not physically in the same landscape. So to look at it more in the sense of here I'm almost like inferring or implying that there should be some kind of sociocratic structure that we haven't talked about yet, which is there's some way for the people who have brought their projects forward to propose funding for them, that there's some way that they have a shared understanding of the strategic priorities of the school, which might be that a member of the leadership council is present, or there's some mechanism by which that is communicated. So that implies there's something more, which is interesting to think about. Because I think for all of us on this call, everyone here except for Janet, because Janet's joining us, well, I guess Simon as well, Simon and Janet both have less understanding of the strategic landscape as it's forming, because they haven't been as actively participating. Whereas all the rest of us have a pretty good shared understanding of the strategic landscape as it's emerging, which is why all of the feedback about the project proposals has been so rich and so constructive. And so that means if we have a way of creating that shared context as the proposals come into the space, then I think that they'll be resolved in a really productive manner. So you can see the if implies governance structure, implies communication of some kind. So I think that that tells us a little more about how we can be thinking about the design of the governance for this. And this gets back at something, Brandon, that you weren't here for, but I think is really helpful to the questions you were raising, which is right now we're focusing on the sandbox of there's $5,000 in the pool of the Design School Fund, but there are interesting questions around how could we use the EDGE prize to mobilize funding into regenerative projects in Cascadia, which is beyond the scope of the Design School Fund itself. So when we're going to the larger budgets, the larger spaces, that's where that strategy landscape is really important. And so I think we're going to want to have some mechanisms we put in place about how the feedbacks occur. So, so this implies other governing structures. The only other governing structure we have at the moment, which is new and figuring out what it is the Leadership Council. So as we have a Leadership Council that is practicing being a Leadership Council, and then we have this group, which is practicing being this group, and there's some communication between them. And then eventually we may have just a Design School admin group that reports to the Leadership Council or reports to the Design School Fund. And so that's where I think that's where a lot of the questions Brandon has will actually come in. And I think that's where your question, Benji, would also come in, is that we would create those contexts. So yeah, it's here we're implying the larger field of governance, implying in the sense that we're seeing it would be helpful to have, and we're actually leaning on the fact we already have it because we're a small group, which is we have shared understanding amongst us of what's going on. That's all I mean. We have that. So we have a sense of strategic priorities right now. But as we grow, we need to be sure there's governance structures in place to maintain it. So yeah, revealing more of the complexity of what's emerging and why it's important to practice small for the Design School Fund now, while also bringing in these bigger questions now. Both of those are helpful things to do.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Brian?
Just on the subject of replicating the Barichara experience of having each of the projects discuss amongst themselves how to allocate the money. It might be an interesting experiment to try, but I think you need a certain minimum number of projects to do an experiment like that involved in the group, maybe a minimum of 3 projects, so that the discussion can be richer and cross more bioregions, and so we could talk about what a minimum number might be and put it forward as an experimental process to see how it goes and what we learn from it.
Yeah. And I think that that's exactly the idea about anything that we're putting forth now is going to be an experiment going forward and is flexible and able to change from occurrence to occurrence. I do just want to acknowledge that we are getting close to the end of time. So we'll let Claire speak, and then we do want to just talk about some of our next steps moving forward with this. Claire?
Yeah, maybe just quickly, just to say, I think these are small enough funds that they're like catalyzers in a landscape, and affirm people that are doing the work. I think it's really important that the funding actually come from the landscape, the majority of it, but something that catalyzes is what I'm like seeding the work and encouraging what needs to get going. So. Thanks.
Okay, and so just to going forward with our next action steps. I think the biggest thing is making this recording and so many of the ideas that were brought forth here visible to the rest of the group so that we can continue this conversation and allow others who weren't able to join us today to give feedback as well. And Joe and Penny, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
I think that, yeah, I don't know, Anna, have you taken good enough notes to start writing a draft of possible criteria and priorities?
Mhm.
And if anyone else has written down any lists of criteria or priorities, if you could send them to Anna, then she could create a Google Doc that we could also all look at. So I think that that would be a good next step, is to aggregate the learnings from the process in the meeting today, share them for feedback, and then also to share the video recording to invite feedback for the members of the fund group who couldn't join the call live. And just to name the value of action, like Benji said, they're doing a leadership retreat that's around the 15th of September, so a little bit less than a month from now. And so it's helpful for us to just remember the real world. This is something I've seen a lot where basically people get really caught in process but don't get back to the feedback of the real world, which is not to pressure us to hurry and make mistakes. It's just to invite us to experiment. And so, and this is actually one of the principles for how sociocracy works, which is a version of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but it's basically, is it good enough to continue? Is it good enough to try? And I think that as an aesthetic, is it good enough to try, is where we want to get to with these criteria, because we'll have the opportunity to update them. And so, and also, as we're revealing the landscape of our primary constraints, such as, well, gosh, what if we wanted more money to allocate? What are the best ways to bring more money in, that flywheel that Simon was talking about? That we can think about things like Roberta having a podcast to spread the word, or us leveraging Regenerate Cascadia in a constructive way to bring in more members, et cetera, et cetera. There are going to be lots of ways to think about this fund in a really dynamic and creative way. That just inviting that as well. So I guess my invitation for the next steps would be to write up a draft of the criteria, to invite them around the proposals that have come forth, which would give us the opportunity to invite any more proposals that want to come forth, but also move into action and decisions quickly with the money we have. And if anyone is inspired to generate discussion around how we raise more funding, how we spread the word, any of these other larger strategic elements, we have a space within Mighty Networks, the DS Fund, where you can propose those ideas and we can start discussions around them. So this can be a really collaborative, dynamic space. That's what I would say as ideas for next steps.
And I would just add on the process of the projects, the people who have proposals, that we start thinking about when we would do that live, like in a live Zoom meeting, so that people could interact around that. So start thinking about when we might do that, and people who have ideas, start thinking about what you would talk about. What would you share with other people in that group around your project?
And I know we're over time, but I just, in the interest of declaring next steps, Roberta and I talked in chat briefly about how we are really excited to move this storytelling forward. And I really need to do a lot of fundraising right now. So maybe we can serve this effort or this interest of creating more or additional fundraising spaces, designing this flywheel, as Simon was saying. Maybe I can catch up with Roberta. If you're too busy, it's fine. But I'll look to hold another space in the Design School Fund area very soon to try to move these balls forward.
Just add one more thing, because it's so concrete. From the point of view of collective sense making, as a group in the discussion today, we basically had a consensus view of what was said, which is not the same as a consensus vote. The consensus view of what was said was, well, if we have $5,000, we shouldn't give all of it to Benji and the leadership retreat, but it's a very worthy project, so it probably should receive some. And other money within that 5,000 should go to the various other priorities that were named. And you could imagine if we took 10 minutes and did a round and we already had a decision-making process, we probably could allocate the money in the next 10 minutes. So I just wanted to notice that from a sense-making point of view. We're actually very close to being able to allocate the money. And so if we just add a little bit more clarity to what are the criteria and how do we make the decisions, I think we can come back and do that sense-making together. And the sense-making we did on the call today, I suspect that what I think is appropriate is probably pretty close to what everyone else thinks, but we don't have a process to articulate it and vote on it. So just naming that as we're actually really close to being able to do that. And maybe one of our desired outcomes is to get to where we can do that to practice. And then move forward for the next round and keep going.
Sounds great. I will try to get all of that up tonight or early tomorrow for everybody. So thank you everyone for joining. We will be in touch soon.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank
Beautiful
you,
job.
everyone. Anna.
Bye.
Right, bye-bye.